Dr. Elara Swift stood in the observation deck of the sprawling space station, staring out into the vastness of the universe. The stars, once familiar and comforting, now seemed distant, alien. The rift was coming. She had been the first to notice it, a faint distortion at the edge of a distant star system, a shift in the fabric of space-time too subtle to be measured by conventional methods, but unmistakable in its nature. And now it was impossible to ignore. The rift had gone from a theoretical anomaly to a harbinger of destruction. "Dr. Swift," came the voice of Captain Jarek Solis from behind her, his tone grim but controlled. Elara turned to face him, noting the dark bags under his eyes. Sleep had become a luxury few could afford. "The council's waiting for your report." Elara nodded, her gaze still fixed on the swirling void. "I'll be right there," she said, her voice distant. She had been staring at the rift for hours, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. What had once been an abstract idea had become something terrifyingly real, a cosmic wound that was eating its way through the galaxy. Captain Solis studied her for a moment before leaving her to her thoughts, understanding her need for solitude in these uncertain times. Minutes later, Elara entered the council's briefing room, where the weight of humanity's survival seemed to rest on her shoulders. Representatives from Earth's surviving colonies, military commanders, and government officials sat in a semicircle, their faces grim as they awaited her update. Elara felt the weight of their gazes upon her as she stepped to the center of the room. "The rift is expanding exponentially," she began, her voice steady despite the overwhelming sense of doom. "We've estimated that within a matter of months, it will consume all the stars within this sector. The energy readings are unlike anything we've ever encountered. Entire solar systems are already beginning to collapse into singularities." A murmur of shock rippled through the room, but Elara continued. "We've made contact with several deep space observatories, and their readings confirm it. The rift isn't a random phenomenon. It's not a natural disaster. Someone or something is causing it." "What do you mean?" General Harkin, the head of the military council, demanded. His voice was sharp, a mix of disbelief and fear. "This is a natural disaster, Elara. It's beyond our comprehension." Elara's eyes narrowed. "I wish that were the case, General, but the data is clear. The rift is an intentional breach. Something or someone is destabilizing spacetime itself, and it's moving toward us." A tense silence followed. The council exchanged uneasy glances. It was the sort of news no one wanted to hear. Humanity had survived the Great Wars, natural disasters, and even the collapse of their homeworld's ecosystem. But this was different. This wasn't just a threat to Earth. It was a threat to the entire universe. "We've been studying alternative realities," Elara continued, her fingers tracing a diagram projected onto the holographic table in front of her. "We believe there's a parallel universe, one that isn't affected by the rift. If we can get there, we might have a chance. Have you considered the cost?" Solis's voice cut through the room, his tone quiet but filled with the weight of experience. "Fleeing to another universe, can we really survive there?" Elara met his gaze. "It's the only option we have left, Captain. The rift will destroy everything, and soon." The room fell silent again, the enormity of their situation sinking in. Then, the council chairperson spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "Prepare for the exodus. We'll need everything we've got. Begin the mission immediately. Time is not on our side." Elara nodded, but as she turned to leave, a thought lingered in her mind. What if the rift wasn't just an enemy of nature? What if it was something far more dangerous, something intelligent, guiding them toward an inevitable fate? The door slid shut behind her, but the question hung in the air unanswered. The fleet's preparation began immediately. In less than 2 weeks, the Exodus project transitioned from theory to execution. The last remnants of humanity's best minds, soldiers, and cultural leaders were selected to board a fleet of advanced ships. Each ship had been specially designed to withstand the chaotic forces of space-time and the unknown dangers that lay ahead. The Vanguard was the flagship, a massive vessel capable of carrying over 1,000 souls, its hull reinforced with the latest anti-rift technologies. Captain Jarek Solis would command it. The other ships, smaller but no less critical, were to serve as support vessels. The Odyssey was the science and engineering ship, housing the brightest minds, including Dr. Elara Swift herself. The Horizon, a military vessel, was commanded by General Harkin, who had been assigned to safeguard the fleet during the journey through unstable space. As the fleet made its final preparations, Elara found herself alone in her quarters, running through the calculations again. She couldn't shake the nagging doubt in her mind. Every scenario she simulated led to the same outcome. No matter how carefully they planned, they were sailing into the unknown. The rift wasn't just a cosmic disaster, it was something far more unpredictable. But there was no turning back. The countdown was on, and Elara had learned long ago that when the stakes were this high, there was no room for second-guessing. The mission must succeed. The launch was a quiet affair. There were no parades, no celebrations, only somber faces and the quiet hum of engines preparing to propel humanity into the unknown. The fleet left Earth Station in the dead of night, cutting through the dark void of space. Solis stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, watching as the Earth grew smaller in the viewscreen. His mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. He had always been a soldier, trained to face the unthinkable. But this was beyond anything he had ever faced. He was responsible not just for a fleet of ships, but for the future of humanity. Elara joined him on the bridge, her face drawn. "We're ready," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of unease. Solis nodded. "We've already lost too much. There's no room for failure now." He turned to face her, his gaze steady but weary. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she replied, though the lines around her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "It's just hard to process. We're about to leave everything behind, and we don't even know where we're going." "I know," Solis said softly, his voice tinged with an understanding that only a soldier could convey. "But we do know this. We have to go. If we stay, we'll die with everyone else." The journey into the rift was not as smooth as they had hoped. As the fleet approached the fringes of the unstable space, the first signs of trouble appeared. The Odyssey began to experience strange gravitational anomalies, its sensors going haywire as waves of energy from the rift distorted the space around them. On the horizon, the crew reported strange glitches in their communication systems, followed by a brief but unnerving silence. Elara's fingers danced over her console, trying to compensate for the sudden fluctuations in the ship's systems. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that the rift wasn't just a cosmic event, it was alive, aware. It was as if the very fabric of reality was pushing back against their intrusion. "We need to push forward," Solis ordered, his voice resolute but tinged with the same unease everyone felt. "No matter what happens, we can't turn back." The fleet had entered the rift's influence. In that moment, something else happened, something none of them had anticipated. A strange, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, as if the universe itself were vibrating in response to their arrival. The lights in the Vanguard flickered. Elara looked up, her pulse quickening. It was the beginning of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Solis stood at the helm, watching as stars blinked out of existence before their very eyes. "Prepare for the worst," he muttered under his breath, knowing that the journey ahead would challenge them in ways they could never foresee. The rift was no longer just a threat, it was hunting them. As the fleet plunged deeper into the rift's influence, the universe around them began to warp in ways that defied logic. At first, it was subtle, shadows shifting too quickly, whispers of voices in the air that weren't there. But soon, the distortions became more violent. Time itself seemed to twist and stretch, and space fluctuated erratically. The ships rattled as though they were caught in the grip of an unseen force, creaking and groaning under the strain. On the Vanguard, Captain Jarek Solis stood at the helm, his eyes glued to the view screen. Space had stopped being space. The familiar stars were gone, replaced by a swirling mass of colors that shifted like liquid, impossible to categorize, impossible to track. The very fabric of reality was coming apart. He clenched his jaw, trying to maintain focus. "Ilara, what's happening?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Ilara Swift, stationed at her console in the science bay, ran the simulations over and over again, her fingers a blur over the keyboard. "I'm not sure," she said, her voice tight. "We're seeing a kind of gravitational wave ripple through space. It's as if the rift is not just consuming everything, it's reshaping reality itself. The laws of physics, they're becoming suggestions rather than rules." Solis turned back to the view screen. The colors swirling outside were hypnotic, like a cosmic storm, a churning mess of energy. He had no idea where they were anymore. They had left the familiar behind, and now they were moving through a place where there were no rules, no logic. It was as though they had crossed a threshold into something beyond comprehension. Suddenly, the ship lurched, sending everyone sprawling. Alarms blared as the Vanguard shuddered violently. The lights flickered, plunging the bridge into darkness for a brief, heart-stopping moment. The ship groaned, its hull creaking as though it might snap in half. "Report," Solis barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've entered a temporal fluctuation." Ilara's voice came back through the comms. "The ship's sensors are malfunctioning. We've experienced a time jump. Some crew members have reported being in different time periods. It's as if we're caught in multiple realities at once." "What do you mean, multiple realities?" Solis demanded. "I mean this," Ilara replied. "I'm seeing myself in the past and the future simultaneously. The entire ship is shifting between time frames. People are experiencing events that happened before the rift even began, and things that haven't happened yet." Her voice trembled, though she fought to keep it steady. "This isn't just a spatial distortion. The rift is restructuring reality around us." Solis gripped the armrest of his chair, feeling the weight of the situation. They weren't just trapped in an unstable region of space. They were moving through a collapsing timeline, where past, present, and future blurred together into a kaleidoscope of fractured moments. It was as if reality itself was breaking apart, and they were caught in the epicenter. A sudden cry of alarm echoed through the ship. "Captain!" It was Lieutenant Ray, the communications officer, her voice filled with panic. "There's something out there, something moving outside the ship." Solis turned to her, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Ray's hand trembled as she gestured to the view screen. A shifting, distorted shape was approaching, an enormous, shadowy form that flickered in and out of existence. At first, it seemed like a mass of debris, but as it grew closer, it became clear that it was something much more. Alive, a colossal sentient entity, its form changing constantly, part of it existing in one moment, another part in another. Ilara's voice cut in, her tone shaken. "That thing, it's not from this universe. It's like an echo of something that's been torn apart by the rift. Something alien." Solis's gaze hardened. He knew they couldn't afford to waste time trying to understand this new threat. "Get us out of here, Ray." Full evasive maneuvers. The Vanguard lurched again as the massive creature, if it could even be called that, pulsed forward, its form twisting and warping like it was being folded between dimensions. But as the ship attempted to veer away, the creature followed, its movement unnatural, its shape contorting with each passing second. Ilara's voice was almost a whisper now, filled with a dawning realization. "We're not just in the rift's path, Solis, we're inside it. It's dragging us through multiple realities. And it's not just watching, it's hunting us." A chill ran through him, and for the first time, Solis felt true fear. They were no longer just escaping a cosmic disaster. They had become part of it. And whatever this thing was, it was part of the rift's design. Something far darker and far more intelligent was guiding them into its grasp, and the real horror had just begun. The vanguard surged forward, the crew now on high alert, as the entity from beyond reality continued to chase them through shifting dimensions. Every second felt like an eternity, and with each moment, they were pulled deeper into a nightmare they could not escape. The vanguard and its accompanying fleet had entered a nightmare. The creature from beyond reality had followed them through every flickering transition in time and space, an ever-present menace that tore at the very fabric of their existence. But as if the disorienting horrors of the rift weren't enough, something darker was stirring within the fleet. It began with small signs, unexplained malfunctions, strange disappearances, and crew members who, when questioned, seemed to have no recollection of events that had occurred hours earlier. But soon, it became clear that something more insidious was happening. People were changing, their behavior erratic, their eyes haunted with a blankness that only came from exposure to forces no human mind could comprehend. Captain Jarek Solis stood on the bridge, his jaw clenched as he stared at the shifting view screen. The alien entity had grown more relentless, its pursuit of the fleet now far more aggressive. They had no safe haven, no escape. "The Lara," Solis called, his voice low. "What's happening to the crew? These aren't just technical failures anymore. Something's wrong." Dr. Elara Swift appeared at his side, her eyes darkened by exhaustion and worry. "It's the rift's influence," she said, her voice tinged with dread. "Whatever that thing is, it's not just an external threat. It's feeding on us, on our minds. The rift isn't just tearing apart space and time. It's destabilizing us, turning us against each other." Solis's hand tightened around the armrest of his chair, and the disappearances. "The Lara, you need to understand," she said, her voice suddenly shaking. "I've been studying the data. The rift, it's alive, it's sentient, and it's controlling the reality around us. We are no longer just victims. We're subjects in whatever game it's playing." The realization settled heavily on his chest, but before he could respond, the voice of Lieutenant Ray crackled through the comms, breaking the tense silence. "Captain, we've lost contact with the Odyssey." Ray's voice was flat, devoid of the usual concern, and it sent a chill down Solis's spine. He whipped around to face her. "What do you mean, lost contact? Have they gone dark?" "Not exactly," Ray replied, her tone strangely distant. "It's more like they've disappeared. No signals, no transmission. It's as if they were never there." Solis's heart skipped a beat. The Odyssey was supposed to be their scientific research vessel. Elara's team was on board, along with some of their most valuable experts. If they'd lost them... Solis's gaze darkened. "Prepare a recon team. We need to know what happened to the Odyssey." The Vanguard drifted toward the coordinates where the Odyssey had last been. The crew was tense, every mind focused on the mystery. But as they neared, the truth became painfully clear. The ship wasn't just lost. It had been reduced to nothing. There were no remains, no debris, no wreckage, no sign that it had ever existed. "We're too late," Elara murmured, her face pale as she stared at the empty expanse where the Odyssey had been. The rift's influence had claimed it, and now they were one step closer to their own destruction. Solis's mind raced, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Something was wrong within their own fleet. The Odyssey's disappearance was just the beginning. He could feel the paranoia seeping into the crew, hear it in their hushed conversations, see it in their eyes. And then, as if to confirm his suspicions, a crew member, Lieutenant Kessler, approached the captain, her expression unreadable. "Captain, I need to speak with you," she said quietly, though Solis could sense something off in her tone. Solis nodded and gestured for her to follow him to the bridge. "What's going on, Kessler? You're not yourself." Kessler's eyes flickered, her pupils widening unnaturally. "It's all a lie, Captain. We're not running from the rift. We're being guided into it. The rift has a purpose for us. We're supposed to join it." Her words struck Solace like a physical blow. For a brief moment, the air between them thickened with tension. "What are you saying?" Solace demanded, his voice rising. "Have you lost your mind?" Kessler's lips curled into a strange, almost knowing smile. "You can't outrun it, Captain. We're all already inside it. You think you're escaping to some alternate universe? No, we're part of the rift now, and it's calling us." Solace recoiled, but Kessler wasn't finished. Her voice grew colder, more detached. "I've seen it, Captain. The rift, it's not just a place. It's a force, a mind, and it wants us, all of us." Alara entered just as Solace stepped back, his expression one of disbelief. "What is she talking about?" Alara asked, though her voice was laced with a growing concern. Before Solace could answer, another voice rang out from the ship's intercom system. "Captain, we've got a problem." Ray's voice was shaky. "There's something moving on board. It's not human." The hair on the back of Solace's neck stood on end as he realized the rift was closer than they thought, and it had already begun to spread its influence within their ranks. What they thought was their enemy outside the fleet was now the enemy within. They weren't just running from a cosmic disaster anymore. They were facing something far worse, a silent, insidious force that would tear them apart from the inside out. The Vanguard was descending into chaos. Captain Jarek Solace stood in the command center, his mind racing as he processed the events that had been unfolding. Lieutenant Kessler's strange revelation lingered in his mind like a shadow, her words echoing in his thoughts. "We're part of the rift now, and it wants us." He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that she was telling the truth. The ship itself had begun to feel alien, as though it were no longer just a vessel of metal and circuits, but something alive. "Alara," Solace said, turning to the scientist, his voice taut. "The crew, something's happening to them. We need to take action before this spreads further." Alara met his gaze, her face pale and drawn. "I know. I've been running simulations, trying to find a way to neutralize the rift's influence, but it's not just a physical force. The rift is infecting minds. It's warping perceptions, distorting thoughts. It's like a virus spreading through the ship, and it's worse than I imagined." Solace clenched his fists, anger and fear bubbling inside him. "If we don't do something, we're all going to be lost. The Odyssey, Kessler, the others, this is just the beginning." Alara nodded. "I've been tracking the fluctuations in the ship's energy field. It's like a hive mind is taking over, reaching out to every person exposed. There's a level of coordination between the disappearances, Captain. It's almost as if the rift itself is orchestrating them." Solace's stomach turned as the realization hit him. The creature they had been running from, the one that had stalked them since the beginning of their journey, wasn't just a mindless monster, it was a conduit for something far more intelligent. Something that was actively pulling them deeper into the rift's grasp, feeding on their fear, manipulating their very minds. Before he could respond, the ship lurched again. This time, the force was so strong that Solace nearly lost his balance. Red warning lights blared throughout the command center. "Alara," Solace shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "What's happening?" She rushed to the control panel, her fingers flying over the console. "We're losing structural integrity in the hull. The rift's influence is growing stronger. It's not just distorting reality anymore, it's tearing the ship apart." Solace's heart pounded in his chest. "Get us out of here. Now." "It's not that simple," Alara said, her voice tense. "The rift is destabilizing space around us. No matter how we adjust our course, we're being pulled deeper. It's like the very space we're traveling through is alive. It's shifting us, manipulating us." Suddenly, an alarm sounded across the ship. The monitors flickered as a massive force collided with the hull. For a moment, the ship groaned under the strain, and then there was a deafening silence. The hum of the engine sputtered, and the lights flickered again. "Report," Solace demanded. "We've been breached," came the voice of Lieutenant Ray, her tone tight with fear. "Section 14. It's completely compromised. We've got multiple hostiles on board, things that shouldn't be here." Solace felt his blood run cold. "What kind of things?" "Shifting entities," Ray's voice faltered. "Not human. They're warping between forms. I don't know how to explain it, Captain. It's like they're not fully part of this reality. The comms cut out abruptly. "Damn it," Solace swore, slamming his fist against the console. "Get us to Section 14. We need to contain this before it spreads." When they arrived at Section 14, the scene before them was a nightmare. The corridor was twisted, its walls buckling as though the very space around it was folding in on itself. Crew members, some disoriented, some screaming, were barricaded in various rooms. Their faces were distorted, eyes wide and hollow, their minds clearly fractured by the rift's influence. A few still clung to their humanity, trying to protect others, but more were lost. The shifting entities, things that defied all logic, glided in and out of existence, their forms constantly changing, flickering like shadows caught in a strobe light. Solace's heart raced as he turned to Ilara. "What the hell are those things?" Ilara's face was pale, her lips trembling. "They're not from our reality. They're like fragments. Echoes of the rift, sentient but broken. They exist in multiple dimensions at once, feeding off the chaos." Solace's mind spun. They had no idea how to fight something that didn't belong to any known plane of existence. And yet, they had to fight. The fate of the entire fleet depended on it. "Ilara," Solace said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at him. "We need to neutralize the rift's influence. Now." Ilara nodded, but as they moved toward the deeper sections of the ship, a low, guttural hum filled the air, growing louder. It wasn't just the creatures. Something else was coming. Solace froze. He felt it in his bones. Something was closing in. The rift wasn't just after them anymore. It was becoming them. And worse yet, they were no longer alone. The creatures weren't the only things hunting them. The rift had learned to speak, and its voice was in their heads. The low hum, a sound like distant thunder, vibrated through the corridors of the Vanguard. It was as though the very walls were alive, resonating with the pulse of the rift itself. Solace tightened his grip on his weapon as he and Ilara pushed deeper into Section 14. Every step they took felt like a violation of the natural order. The ship was warping around them, time stretching and folding in impossible ways. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch and contract like an elastic band, never quite holding its form. "Did you hear that?" Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Solace nodded. The hum was louder now, an overwhelming presence that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it wasn't just the sound that unnerved him. It was the voice, faint at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind, but growing clearer with every passing moment. "You cannot escape. You are part of us." The words crawled across his skin like 1,000 tiny insects, each syllable sinking into his mind with chilling clarity. He staggered, his head swimming with disorienting thoughts that weren't his own. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw someone, standing in the hallway ahead. A figure, tall and thin, with no discernible face. But it wasn't human. The figure flickered in and out of existence like a glitch in reality, its presence both terrifying and magnetic. "Captain." Ilara's voice broke through the haze, snapping him back to reality. "We need to keep moving. If we don't contain this, it's not just the Odyssey we'll lose, it's everything." He blinked hard, shaking his head to clear the fog that threatened to consume him. "Right, let's go." They moved forward cautiously, every step heavy with the weight of their situation. The flickering figure disappeared as they approached, leaving behind only an oppressive silence. As they reached the end of the corridor, they found the source of the breach, a massive rift in the ship's hull, its edges glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The rift was not just a physical tear in the ship, it was a doorway, an opening to something beyond the known universe, beyond reality itself. Through the rip, Sullus could see glimpses of other worlds, worlds that should not exist, filled with grotesque landscapes and twisted beings that seemed to watch them, eyes gleaming with hunger. A cold shiver ran down Sollus's spine. The rift was alive, and it was hungry. "We need to close it," Elara said, her voice tight with urgency. "Now." She quickly moved to a nearby control panel, her hands flying over the console as she worked to seal the breach. But as she worked, Sollus's attention was drawn to the shadowy figure that had reappeared. It was there, standing at the edge of the rift, its form distorting with every blink of his eyes. This time, though, it wasn't just watching, it was speaking. "We are not your enemies. We are your future." The voice was louder now, reverberating through the very air around them. It was everywhere, in his mind, in his bones, in the space between his heartbeats. Sullus felt a creeping horror settle in his chest. The rift wasn't just trying to consume them, it was trying to convert them. To merge them with whatever it was, to make them part of its twisted, fractured reality. The whispers were growing louder, their words more insistent. "Come, join us, be whole." Ilara's voice broke through again, her words sharp and focused. "Captain, we're running out of time." He turned to her, his mind still reeling from the strange, hypnotic pull of the rift. He forced himself to focus, to shake off the oppressive whispers that clawed at his sanity. They had no time for this. They couldn't afford to listen. "Hurry, Ilara," he shouted, his voice strained. Ilara's hands moved faster now, her brow slick with sweat as she worked to stabilize the systems. But the rift was fighting back. The console sparked, sending a cascade of electrical feedback that rattled her to the core. The ship groaned, the walls warping and pulsing in rhythm with the ever-encroaching rift. It was pulling them in, and they could feel it, like gravity itself had become corrupted, warped into something darker, more dangerous. Sullus heard it then, a roar. A deep guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the air itself, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the breach, from the very core of the rift. "Ilara," he shouted again, his voice rising in panic. "It's coming." She didn't look up from the panel. "I can't, it's..." A blinding flash erupted from the rift, overwhelming them both. The force of the explosion threw Sullus to the ground. His vision blurred as the ship's systems short-circuited, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, through the dark, came the voice again, clearer than ever. "Join us, Captain. You cannot resist. You are ours." Sullus fought to stay conscious, but the pull was unbearable. His mind swam in the rift's energy, every thought twisted, every memory fractured. As he fell into unconsciousness, he realized the rift wasn't just manipulating reality. It was rewriting it, one mind at a time. And they were all its puppets now. When he woke, the world was different. The Vanguard no longer felt like home. It felt alien. And the crew? They were no longer the people he had known. They were them now. And he was no longer sure if he could trust anyone. Not even himself. Solis awoke to a cold, disorienting darkness. His body felt heavy, as though gravity itself had been twisted. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and his vision swam in and out of focus. He tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea forced him to lie back down. His mind was clouded, the memories of the previous moments scattered like fragments of a shattered mirror. The rift? The thought hit him like a tidal wave. He had been so close to stopping it, but now, what had happened? His fingers trembled as he reached up to touch his face. The cold metal of his uniform scraped against his skin, but something was wrong. The world around him felt off-kilter, as if reality itself was stretching and bending, refusing to hold its shape. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest, and the faint pulse of light began to return to the dark room. Slowly, the shadows began to dissipate, revealing the eerie glow of the ship's walls. But something was wrong. Those walls were not the same as they had been. They pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Solus struggled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. His senses slowly returned, and the horrific truth began to settle in. The Vanguard had changed. The ship no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt like a prison. It felt like the rift itself had stretched its tendrils through the walls, claiming the very bones of the vessel. The corridors were silent, eerily so. Not a single sound of life could be heard, and yet he knew, he could feel it. The ship was not empty. It had changed them, changed him. "Captain?" Ilara's voice broke through the stillness, but it wasn't her usual calm, reassuring tone. There was something hollow in it, something distant. Solus turned toward the sound of her voice, his heart skipping a beat. She was standing in the doorway, her face gaunt and pale, eyes wide but unblinking. Her uniform, once neat and orderly, now looked disheveled, torn in places. But it wasn't her appearance that caught his attention. It was the empty look in her eyes. The same emptiness that had overtaken Kessler and others. She was gone. And yet she stood there, as if waiting for him to join her. "Ilara," Solus's voice cracked. He tried to step forward, but something held him back. The words, "You are ours," echoed in his mind again. Ilara's lips curled into a slow, eerie smile. "We're not alone anymore, Captain. The rift is part of us now. Part of you." Solus staggered back, his mind reeling. He wanted to run, to escape, but where could he go? The ship was now part of the rift's realm, and so was he. The influence was everywhere, saturating the very air they breathed. And Ilara, standing there in the doorway, wasn't the woman he had once known. She had already been claimed by the rift. "We are the future," Ilara continued, her voice almost soothing. "The rift has seen us. It has chosen us. And now, we are part of it. Don't you see? We are becoming whole. One mind, one being." The words "one being" sent a shiver through Solus's spine. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but deep down, he knew the truth. The rift wasn't just manipulating their minds, it was rewriting who they were, turning them into something other, something inhuman. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. But Ilara didn't move. She simply stood there, her smile never wavering. Suddenly, a distant scream echoed through the ship, a scream that rattled his bones. It was cut off abruptly, followed by the unmistakable sound of something ripping, like flesh tearing from bone. "Ilara," Solus breathed, barely able to speak. "What have you done?" She didn't respond. Instead, her eyes darkened, and the empty smile remained fixed on her face. "They are all becoming us." Solus turned and fled down the hallway, his feet pounding against the warped, pulsing floors. The ship seemed to be alive, shifting, twisting, and closing in on him from all sides. Every shadow felt like an enemy, every flicker of light a prelude to something worse. He couldn't run forever, he knew that. He had to find a way to stop it. But as he rounded a corner, a sight stopped him in his tracks. The hallway ahead was filled with people, his crew, his comrades, but they weren't the people he had known. They stood motionless, their bodies twitching and convulsing as though they were caught in some kind of trance. Their eyes were blank, their faces frozen in strange, unsettling smiles. And then, as one, they turned to face him. Solus froze, his breath catching in his throat. They were not human anymore. They were reduced to echoes of what they had once been, their minds fully consumed by the rift. They were the rift. "You can't escape," Ilara's voice echoed from behind him, distant yet omnipresent. "You were never meant to." The walls around him shuddered, bending and stretching in impossible ways, as if they too were caught in the rift's grasp. "Join us, Captain, you cannot resist." Solus took a step back, his hands trembling. It was too late. The rift had already claimed them all, and now it was coming for him. Solus's mind raced, panic seizing him as the crew, his friends, his soldiers, slowly advanced, their faces twisted with the same eerie, hollow smile that Ilara wore. They were no longer the people he knew. They were fragments, echoes of the rift, and the rift was hungry. "Get away from me!" Solus shouted, his voice raw, but his words seemed to fade into the surrounding noise. The hum of the ship, the pulsing, alien rhythm of the rift's presence, consumed everything. His mind felt like it was being pulled in multiple directions, each thought being eaten before it could form. The rift was twisting space around him, stretching time, creating a reality that bent and folded in on itself like a house of mirrors. The very air felt thicker now, each breath harder to take. The walls were breathing. The ship, no, the rift itself, was alive. He could see them now, his crew, fully possessed by the rift. Their bodies twitched, moving in sync like marionettes. They whispered in unison, the words impossible to ignore. "Join us. You are one with the rift. We are one." The vision of his crew's faces blurred as Solus's mind screamed for a way out. There was no escape. No ship, no system, no reality that could shield him from the rift's pull. It was all-consuming, but as he stepped back, something caught his eye. Through the haze of warping light, he saw a shadow moving in the distance, something not quite human but familiar, something that hadn't been changed. It was Kessler. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her eyes no longer empty. There was a spark of recognition there, a glimmer of the woman she had once been. Her face was pale, but she wasn't consumed. Not entirely. She was different, yes, but she hadn't crossed that final line. Not yet. "Help me," Solus's mind screamed, though he could not speak. Kessler's eyes locked with his, and for a moment he saw her flinch. She was still in there, she was still fighting, but the rift was closing in on her, pulling her back toward its embrace, like an insatiable tide. Solus took a step toward her, but his feet felt heavy, as if the very floor was trying to hold him down. He had to act. He couldn't let her fall further into this madness. Kessler raised a hand, a trembling gesture that held both fear and hope. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "You have to stop it, Jurek. Stop it before it takes you too." The words broke through the fog of his mind, like a lifeline in a storm. He understood now. The rift wasn't just spreading, it was growing. It wasn't merely taking them, it was becoming them. And if he didn't stop it now, he would be no different than the hollow, empty faces of his crew. He would be lost forever. But how? The ship, his crew, his very body. Everything was already folding into the rift, its influence so deep that he couldn't even trust his own senses anymore. Reality was slipping away. Then he remembered Ilara's words. The rift is not just a tear in space, it's a window, a point of convergence. You have to sever the connection. Destroy the breach before it takes all of us. Solus's mind snapped into focus. The rift, the tear in the fabric of reality. It was more than just a passageway. It was the root of the rift's power. If he could destroy it, he might be able to close the doorway, to sever its hold on the ship and its crew. But the closer he got, the more the rift fought back. The walls bent in on him. His vision swirled, disorienting flashes of memories, some his own, some not, flashed before his eyes. The rift was trying to overwhelm him, to force him into its grasp. "No," Solus whispered, clenching his fists. "No, I won't let it." He gritted his teeth and lunged toward the breach. His hands moved frantically over the control panel, pushing buttons, overriding systems, anything to disrupt the connection between the ship and the rift. The ship trembled, the very bones of the Vanguard creaking and moaning as it fought to keep the tear open. The rift's voice, deep and maddening, echoed in his mind. "We are forever. You cannot win." But Solus didn't stop. With a final, desperate cry, he activated the emergency shutdown, the only way to close the rift. The ship shook violently. The lights flickered. A deafening roar filled the air as the walls buckled under the strain. For a moment, everything was still, silent. And then, with a burst of raw energy, the rift's grip on the Vanguard shattered. The breach closed, the pulsing energy that had been siphoning life from the ship flickered and died. Solus collapsed to the floor, his body exhausted from the mental and physical strain. He could hear Kessler's voice in his mind, faint but there. She was still fighting. He had done it. The rift was sealed, for now. But the silence was deafening. The ship was no longer alive, no longer pulsing with the rift's presence. And yet, as Solus lay there, struggling to stay conscious, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The rift had been closed, but had it really been defeated? Somewhere, in the vast, untamed expanse of the universe, the rift was waiting. It always was. And it was only a matter of time before it came for them again. But for now, Solus had one victory. One fragile moment of peace. And in the darkness of the Vanguard, with the flickering lights as his only company, Captain Jarek Solus realized that the rift had not just touched their ship, it had touched them, and they would never be the same again.